World War II. Weapons officers didn't want troops to use, they issued the orders. They wrote the manuals, they trained the men, and then the men went to war and threw the manual away. Every military in World War II had rules about weapons. Which ones to carry, which ones were authorized, which ones were too dangerous, too unreliable, or simply too brutal for official sanction. The reasons were often logical, sometimes political. Occasionally, they were just bureaucratic habit dressed up as doctrine. But doctrine doesn't stop a bullet. And when men are dying in the mud, in the jungle, in the frozen rubble of a collapsing city, they stop asking what's authorized. They start asking what works. This is the story of 12 weapons that soldiers were told to ignore, abandon, or never touch, and the desperate, dangerous reasons they used them anyway. Number 12. The trench knife that was called too savage. The U.S. M1918 Mark I trench knife was a relic of the previous war, a double-edged blade with a knuckle-duster grip designed for close-quarters killing. By World War II, American military planners had largely moved on. The official position was that the modern soldier didn't need a dedicated fighting knife. The bayonet was enough. The rifle was enough. They were wrong. In the Pacific Theater, where jungle combat collapsed distances to mere feet, soldiers discovered that rifles were too long to swing, bayonets too awkward to draw, and pistols sometimes too loud to risk. Men who'd managed to acquire trench knives, through family, through trade, through outright theft from supply depots, found themselves alive in situations where their officially equipped comrades were not. The concern from officers wasn't purely practical. There was a moral dimension. A trench knife implied a willingness to kill at intimate range, to look at a man and make a choice with your hands. Some commanders felt this mindset was corrosive, that it made men too comfortable with killing, that it blurred lines they preferred to keep sharp. The men who survived the jungle didn't see a moral problem. They saw a tool. Whether the officers were protecting their soldiers' humanity or simply their own comfort with war's brutality, that question was never cleanly answered. Number 11. The shotgun that violated the rules of war. In 1918, Germany formally protested the American use of the Winchester Model 1897 pump-action shotgun, arguing it violated the Hague Convention. The protest went nowhere legally, but the controversy never fully disappeared. When World War II began, the U.S. military quietly reissued shotguns for limited roles, guarding prisoners, clearing buildings, jungle patrol. But many officers discouraged their frontline use, not because they were ineffective, but because of the lingering legal and reputational shadow. The men in the Pacific ignored this entirely. At distances under 20 meters in dense vegetation, a 12-gauge load of buckshot was devastatingly effective in a way that a rifle simply wasn't. Marines and Army infantry learned that in an ambush, the first 3 seconds were everything, and nothing filled those 3 seconds with stopping power like a pump shotgun. The risk was real, too. Shotguns had limited range, limited penetration, and required more frequent reloading in prolonged engagements. A soldier who'd committed to a shotgun in a firefight that stretched beyond the tree line could find himself dangerously underarmed. But many of those soldiers never saw a firefight stretch beyond the tree line. Many of them were dead before it could. The shotgun was a gamble. So was everything else. Number 10. The German weapons that American soldiers collected and fired. The official policy was clear. American soldiers were to use American weapons. Enemy weapons were to be surrendered, cataloged, or destroyed. Using captured German equipment in combat was actively discouraged, not just for supply reasons, but because in the chaos of battle, a soldier firing a German weapon might be mistaken for the enemy. This was not an unreasonable concern. It got men killed. And yet, the German MP-40 submachine gun, the MG-42 machine gun, the Luger pistol, these were prized beyond almost anything the Army issued. The MP-40 was compact, controllable, and devastating at close range. The MG-42 had a rate of fire that American machine guns couldn't match. And the Luger was so beautifully engineered that soldiers risked their lives to take them from dead Germans. Units in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe developed informal economies around captured weaponry. Soldiers traded rations, cigarettes, and favors for German arms. Some kept them hidden from officers. Others had officers who quietly looked the other way, or who had their own captured pistols holstered beneath their jackets. The danger was real. Men did die from friendly fire after being mistaken for German troops. But the lure of superior equipment in a war where your survival depended on firepower was more powerful than any memo from headquarters. What would you choose? A worse weapon you're authorized to carry, or a better one that might get you shot by your own side? Number 9. The flamethrower that destroyed morale on both sides. The M2 flamethrower was issued. It was authorized. It was, in the Pacific Theater, brutally effective against Japanese bunkers and fortified positions. Officers didn't forbid its use, but many quietly dreaded it. The problem wasn't tactical. It was psychological. Flamethrower operators became priority targets. Japanese soldiers, and later German ones in Europe, were trained to identify and eliminate flamethrower teams first, before any other threat. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in active combat was, by some estimates, measured in minutes rather than hours. Beyond that, the weapon required operators to move toward the enemy within range of small arms fire while carrying tanks of highly flammable fuel on their backs. A single lucky shot could turn a man into a torch. The fuel tanks were not designed to explode easily, but they didn't need to explode. They just needed to burn. Many soldiers refused the assignment when they could. Others accepted it and found ways to avoid the most exposed situations. A few became almost legendary for their ability to survive repeated deployments with the weapon. The deeper discomfort that officers rarely articulated was this: the flamethrower didn't just kill. It inflicted a death that was visible, prolonged, and unforgettable to anyone who witnessed it. It changed the men who used it. It changed the men who watched. Some things can't be trained away. Number 9. The flamethrower that destroyed morale on both sides. The M2 flamethrower was issued. It was authorized. It was, in the Pacific Theater, brutally effective against Japanese bunkers and fortified positions. Officers didn't forbid its use, but many quietly dreaded it. The problem wasn't tactical. It was psychological. Flamethrower operators became priority targets. Japanese soldiers, and later German ones in Europe, were trained to identify and eliminate flamethrower teams first, before any other threat. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in active combat was, by some estimates, measured in minutes rather than hours. Beyond that, the weapon required operators to move toward the enemy within range of small arms fire while carrying tanks of highly flammable fuel on their backs. A single lucky shot could turn a man into a torch. The fuel tanks were not designed to explode easily, but they didn't need to explode. They just needed to burn. Many soldiers refused the assignment when they could. Others accepted it and found ways to avoid the most exposed situations. A few became almost legendary for their ability to survive repeated deployments with the weapon. The deeper discomfort that officers rarely articulated was this: the flamethrower didn't just kill. It inflicted a death that was visible, prolonged, and unforgettable to anyone who witnessed it. It changed the men who used it. It changed the men who watched. Some things can't be trained away. Number 7. The Liberator pistol nobody believed. In the FP-45 Liberator was one of the strangest weapons of the war. A single-shot, smooth-bore pistol manufactured for approximately $2.50. It was designed to be airdropped by the millions into occupied territories. A weapon for resistance fighters and civilians to take one German soldier's weapon and continue the fight. The American military establishment was deeply skeptical. Many officers believed the weapon was so crude, so limited, and so likely to get its user killed in the attempt to fire it that the entire program was close to criminal. They had a point. The Liberator was accurate to roughly 20 feet. It held one round. Reloading required removing the empty case with a stick or similar tool, inserting a new cartridge, and closing the weapon. A process that took long enough that, in any situation where a second shot was needed, the user was almost certainly already dead. And yet, the psychological value was real. Occupying forces couldn't know which civilian was armed, couldn't know where the weapons had fallen, couldn't know who had been trained by a resistance network and who simply found a pistol in a field. The Liberator wasn't really a weapon. It was a threat, a possibility. A reason for a soldier to think twice before treating every civilian as harmless. Whether that psychological leverage was worth the lives of resistance fighters who tried to use it in genuine combat, the historical verdict remains genuinely uncertain. Number 6. The bonsai sword that soldiers were ordered to surrender. If you've made it this far, what follows gets stranger and darker. Japanese officers carried swords into battle, some ceremonial, many fully functional. American soldiers were explicitly ordered to surrender these as military property, to be cataloged and sent through official channels. The reasoning was partly about intelligence, partly about preventing a black market in war trophies. The order was almost universally ignored. The swords became the most coveted trophies of the Pacific War. Men shipped them home at extraordinary personal risk, hiding them in duffel bags, bribing port inspectors, mailing them piece by piece. The emotional significance was profound. Here was a tangible symbol of an enemy who had seemed, at the war's beginning, almost mythologically dangerous. Taking a sword was taking proof that the myth could be defeated. But some soldiers went further. They used the swords, not ceremonially, in combat. In the nightmarish close quarters fighting of the island campaigns, where ammunition ran low and positions collapsed into hand-to-hand struggle, captured swords became impromptu weapons. Whether this was more dangerous to the user than to the enemy is a question several veterans answered in different ways, none of them entirely comfortable with the memory. Number 5. The Sten gun, that was distrusted by everyone who carried it. The British Sten submachine gun was cheap, fast to produce, and widely issued to Allied forces and resistance fighters across occupied Europe. Officers promoted it as a reliable tool of modern warfare. The men who carried it called it a death trap. The Sten had a well-documented tendency to fire accidentally when dropped, when jolted, or when its magazine was bumped at the wrong angle. British paratroopers reported Stens discharging on landing. Resistance fighters learned to carry them with the magazine removed until the moment of action. There were confirmed cases of soldiers killed by their own Stens before they ever reached the enemy. And yet, in the hands of a careful, experienced operator who understood the weapon's peculiarities, the Sten was genuinely effective. It fired a common cartridge compatible with German magazines, which made resupply easier for partisans operating behind enemy lines. It was small enough to be concealed, and at close range, in the right hands, it was lethal. The men who distrusted it weren't wrong. Neither were the men who swore by it. They had simply learned different lessons from the same weapon, lessons written in very different kinds of ink. Number 4. The Molotov cocktail. That armies refused to officially sanction, no major military officially trained its soldiers in the production or use of improvised incendiary devices during World War II. The legal and ethical questions were too complicated. The risk of accident was too high, and there was something about handing soldiers a bottle of gasoline with a burning rag that felt, to military planners, like an admission that the formal supply chain had failed. It had, repeatedly. The risks were not trivial. Glass bottles broke prematurely. Flames traveled backward along fuel trails. Men in confined spaces became part of the fire they'd created. There was no safety manual for a weapon that had no safety features. But a burning tank was a stop tank, and sometimes that was everything. Number 3. The poison gas canisters that were present but never supposed to be used. Every major power in World War II deployed chemical weapons stockpiles, not for use, officially, but as deterrence. The logic was mutual assured destruction. If Germany used gas, the Allies would respond in kind, and so neither side crossed the line. Officially, what the history shows is more complicated. Chemical munitions were present on multiple fronts. The sinking of the SS John Harvey at Bari in 1943, which was secretly carrying American mustard gas bombs, released enough agent to kill or wound over 1,000 Allied personnel and Italian civilians, while governments initially denied the ship's cargo. Beyond accidents, there are documented instances of lower-level commanders suggesting chemical options in desperate tactical situations. These requests were denied. The political and strategic consequences of breaking the taboo were correctly judged to outweigh any local military advantage. But the fact that the requests were made at all tells a story. When men are losing badly enough, they stop thinking about the rules of war. They start thinking about whatever stops the dying. The line held in World War II, barely. What would have happened had it broken is a calculation that no one has ever fully wanted to complete. Number 2. The sawed-off rifle. That was a court-martial offense. Modifying military-issued weapons was explicitly forbidden. The reasons were practical. Standardized weapons meant standardized parts, standardized training, standardized supply chains. A soldier who modified his rifle created a weapon that the army couldn't maintain, couldn't repair, and potentially couldn't trust in the hands of another soldier if its original user was killed. And yet, across every theater, soldiers cut down barrels, removed stocks, rewired trigger mechanisms, and modified their weapons in ways that would have horrified their instructors. The most common modification was shortening. A rifle with a cut-down barrel was shorter, lighter, and faster to bring to bear in confined spaces. It was also less accurate at range, louder, and produced a larger muzzle flash that could give away a position in darkness. In the ruins of Stalingrad, where Soviet and German soldiers fought room by room, sometimes on opposite sides of the same wall, standard-length rifles were almost useless. The men who survived longest were often the men who'd made their weapons fit the environment, regardless of what the manual said. Officers who discovered modified weapons faced a choice: report the soldier for a court-martial offense, or understand that the modification had probably kept him alive long enough to be found. Most chose understanding. The rules existed for good reasons. The world they were written for often didn't. Number 1. The captured enemy uniform. That could get you shot as a spy. Under the laws of war, wearing an enemy uniform in combat was not merely against military regulations. It was a crime under international law, punishable by death. A soldier captured in enemy uniform could be executed immediately, without trial, as an unlawful combatant. Every military in World War II knew this. It was written into the training of every officer on every side. And it happened anyway. German soldiers in Operation Greif, Scorseni's infamous 1944 mission, dressed in American uniforms and drove American vehicles deep into Allied lines during the Battle of the Bulge. The strategic damage they inflicted was limited. The psychological damage was catastrophic. American checkpoints began stopping everyone. Rumors spread that German infiltrators had orders to assassinate Eisenhower. An entire Allied army became briefly paralyzed by suspicion of itself. The captured German infiltrators were executed, but the practice wasn't exclusively German. Allied operatives, OSS agents, resistance fighters, many operated in enemy uniforms at various points, under the logic that the mission was more important than the rule. And the rule was one they were willing to die for if caught. They often were. This is the deepest question that weapons and rules of war eventually arrive at, not which weapon is most effective or which regulation most carefully written, but how much a person is willing to risk and sacrifice and become in order to survive something that was never supposed to be survivable. Every weapon on this list existed in a space between what was written and what was real, between the world that military planners prepared for and the world that soldiers actually found. The men who broke the rules were not always heroes. Some of them were reckless, some were criminal, some were simply terrified and out of options. And some of the officers who wrote those rules were not wrong. They were writing for a world that made sense before the world stopped making sense. What World War II ultimately revealed was not which weapons won the war. It revealed how far human beings will go when the alternative is not coming home. The rules were written by men who understood war in the abstract. The weapons were used by men who understood it in the only way that truly counts.